All right. Well, Jackson, if it's okay, I think it's now time to move from your story to your current beliefs in the church,
Yeah, feel free.
uh, because I think that would be really interesting. Is that all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So let's just begin at the top. Um, you haven't loved the term neo-apologist, but you have described yourself as a liberal or as a
Maybe, yeah,
progressive sort
yeah,
of
maybe more
believer.
progressive.
So how do you describe your beliefs or flavor or style within the church?
So I mentioned earlier how my interfaith and religious studies efforts are they very much serve to color my current perspective as a Mormon, right? So one thing that I would say kind of sets me apart, I usually contrast myself against kind of correlation generation or correlation Mormonism, because I recognize that Mormonism or LDS Mormonism hasn't been a static entity since its inception. It's witnessed a fair amount of development. There's different time periods and different perspectives that are held within the faith, both in leadership and in membership. And so the Mormonism of Brigham Young is going to be different than the Mormonism of Bruce R. McConkie, which is going to be different than the Mormonism of me or Terrell Givens, or, I just recognize the diversity in Mormonism and recognize that it's not necessarily a monolithic experience, that people can have different takes on the faith, and that's okay. I would kind of compare that to maybe forms of Judaism today, where you have lots of different types of Jews, even within the same synagogue, who might believe very different things or have different takes on the faith, and that's encouraged and accepted. I wouldn't say the LDS Church is necessarily at the same place institutionally, in terms of making as much room or promoting a lot of diversity in belief. Like, we still hold on to a lot of orthodoxy, but I certainly recognize that within the faith community, and I look to individuals who have varying kinds of belief, and I just kind of draw from a lot of them, and a lot of them are general authorities too. So as far as my faith goes, it's pretty universalistic in terms of like salvation or things like that. I do hold to, like, let's say, progression between the kingdoms. And I think that's very much influenced by my mom leaving the faith and different family members and friends leaving the faith too, because, I don't see her as or people who leave necessarily as a son/daughter of perdition. I don't see them as apostates who are lost forever. Like seriously, and you know this more than I do, John, firsthand. Like, there's legitimately people who think you are like the devil incarnate, just because you were excommunicated. I think that's so wrong, right? Like, we get these caricatures built up of people who leave the faith, and so I don't hold to those, for one. And I do believe in progression between kingdoms. So because of my belief in a God that I assume to be just and fair and understanding, I don't think any of us in this life can have an absolute knowledge of pretty much anything. Like, none of us have the full picture. All of us, as Paul would put it in the New Testament, we see through a glass darkly. So even, and I see prophets the same way, like, even individuals that I look to as inspired have a limited understanding. And none of us are going to have the opportunity to have a fuller understanding until Judgment Day itself, when we can look and see the full picture and be like, okay, like, that's how it is. I'm making my choice now. I don't see a just God holding limited life experience and understanding against us for eternity. I definitely don't believe in a God who damns people to hell for eternity. I don't know how someone could believe in a God. Like, if there is a God like that, nothing I do is going to change that. But as far as a deity that I would see as deserving of worship and admiration, is one that kind of assists us like a parent would with a child to develop and to learn from mistakes and to just keep moving forward. So I do believe in progression between kingdoms. I don't see myself as unorthodox with that or counter-orthodox. I look to different general authorities, different church leaders in the past who do have that same viewpoint of progression between kingdoms. So I don't feel like I'm not being Mormon by believing that. I feel like it's up in the air as far as, there's no official doctrine or consensus on the matter, but I look to quotes and teachings from different general authorities in the past. And, so I gain validation from that. So it also colors how I view people of different religions. Because of my exposure to interfaith, I have read, lots of different religious texts. I've read the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the Tao Te Ching, the Upanishads, the major texts of many, many different faiths, right? I've taken the time to read them, to study them, and I've gone to so many places of worship at this point that I've lost track of it, both Christian and non-Christian. And talking to so many different people, I've seen so much beauty, and I've seen so much truth, and I've seen so much good that's taught in faiths outside my own. I've witnessed it myself. There's so many things that I look to in other religions that I experience what Krister Stendahl would label as holy envy, that I want to incorporate into my own spirituality. And how I see Mormonism as an inclusive religion. I can look to statements from Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and other individuals who advocate for going out and seeking different truths and just gathering it all up. And that's what Mormonism is all about, is just finding what truth you can and just shoring it all up and being open to it. So that's what I try and live. So as part of my scripture study, I will read from the standard works and whatnot. But I usually am reading something non-Mormon at the same time to try and gain some inspiration, because I'm just trying to keep myself open to as much wisdom and truth as I can. And both inside the Mormon faith and outside of it, I just take what is good and virtuous and deserving of my attention and what I feel like I should incorporate into my life. And the aspects that aren't too good, I just I don't feel compelled to accept them, because I'm someone who, when it comes down to what I believe in, at the point that I am at, I no longer am comfortable bearing a testimony when I don't mean it, of things that I don't mean. So there's a few things that I will say, like, I know this is true, right? There's things that I'll say, I believe this is true, and I do break down my kind of beliefs in that sense. But I'm just very open. And I think that people in other faiths are there because God placed them to be there. Like, statistically, even though it runs a little counter to a narrative that, myself or others might have been raised with, I don't necessarily believe that being Mormon in this life is what it's all about. That, like, we are sent to earth to be Mormon, right? I think in just terms of a mere numbers game, if being Latter-day Saint, an LDS Mormon, was so important, then like 0.0002% of the Earth's population can ever have that chance to live as a Mormon in mortality. You know what I mean? Like, the odds are just so utterly stacked against us that it just opens up my perspective and looking at all these different experiences. And I have to think that they're there for a reason, that God has placed them there. Actually, I have a good quote, if I can share it. God has essentially placed these individuals here for the purpose of experiencing different things. Gosh, I had it just right there.
Two things that listeners have written in so far. While you're looking for that quote, I'm just going to stall and buy you time. Heath Hendrickson writes, I love your, nice deity, but is it the Mormon God that you're talking about? So Heath is questioning whether you're sort of universalistic, progression between kingdoms, lots of paths are valid sort of God. Is that really the Mormon God? So that's a question from Heath. Okay. And then another person basically is saying, if you don't believe the purpose of life is to become a Latter-day Saint, then why go on a mission and convert people to the LDS Church? So
I'll be
hopefully you found your quote, and then you can go back and answer those other things.
Yeah, so I looked at quotes like this from Brigham Young or others. Brigham Young is just saying, if people have a law, no matter who made it, and do the best they know how, they will have a glory which is beyond your imagination. By any description I might give, you cannot conceive of the least portion of God, of the glory of God prepared for his beings, the workmanship of my hands. Or so far as mortality is concerned, millions of the inhabitants of this earth live according to the best light they have, according to the best knowledge they possess. I have told you frequently that they will receive according to their works, and all who live according to the best principles in their possession, or that they can understand, will receive peace, glory, comfort, joy, and a crown that will be far beyond what they are anticipating. There's many other quotes like this, and I feel like this is a legitimate Mormon belief, one of inclusivity or recognition that I could very easily support, with a whole plethora of quotes and teachings and official statements from the church, where we look to individuals outside the church as possessing light and truth and true principles still, and we encourage them to live those true principles. I don't think Mormonism claims a monopoly on the truth, at least not the Mormonism I believe in. There might be individuals like, maybe McConkie or someone who might be more insular, right? But I think from a pretty early stage, like, Mormons have been pretty comfortable recognizing truth in other religions. And even though we do usually put ourselves on a pedestal as possessing a greater truth, or, the fullness of the gospel, things like that, I think there's still, it's applicable both ways. Latter-day Saints, if they are living authentically, are operating based off the best truth that they have available to them, just as much as any other person is, right? So at least for me, like, just because I'm a Latter-day Saint, I don't think I've crossed the finish line. In fact, like, I feel very much at the same point as many other people do, in that I'm just operating based off the best things that I have available to me. Like, this is what I'm comfortable with. This is my beliefs. I'm moving forward with these things.
So let me just tell you a couple of reactions I have, and we'll keep digging into this. When you keep talking about progression between kingdoms, what I hear you saying is that, and when you couple that with your statement that the purpose of existence isn't necessarily to be LDS, what I hear you saying is there are many paths to exaltation. The Mormon Church is one path, but there are other paths too, and we don't understand all the complexities of that. So let's stop this idea that we're better than others, that the Mormon path is superior to all others. There are lots of paths, and in the end, people can reach that ultimate destination of exaltation through lots of paths. Is that an okay summary of what I heard you say, or would you correct that?
I don't want anyone to be confused and make me out to be some kind of relativist where I don't believe in absolute truths. I do believe in absolute truth, and I do believe, things matter in the end, and that there are exclusive truth claims between religions, that they can't all be right at the same time. But that doesn't mean that there aren't true principles or values or things taught in these different faiths. I would like to think of it as kind of a super highway, right? Our destination is our individual exaltation or perfection or whatever, just the betterment of ourselves, right? And these different religions, they can all get to this point, but at the end of the day, they all kind of merge onto the same super highway, So I can't speak towards what the afterlife is like. I don't think very many people can with any kind of absolute knowledge, just because we're not there yet, right? But I'd like to think that at the end of the day, denominations or religious identities in the afterlife, they kind of they're not as important as what kind of person are you, where are you at, and what did you do with what was given to you. I'd like to think that is of greater importance than whether or not you have a particular religious label or not, or you identify with a particular community. I think they all just kind of, at least that's where I'm at, so I'm universalist in that sense. I do believe in saving ordinances, and I do hold to like kind of exclusive Mormon truth claims. But I recognize that that's just me, that's my decision. That's where I'm at. Other people may think differently. and we're all going to find out eventually. So, I'm doing the best that I can with what I have. I invite others to do the same, and I trust that it's going to work out.
So you're saying you do see some unique import to the church's claims to exclusive authority and for the need for LDS saving ordinances. And you're sort of suspending ultimate judgment as to what's ultimately going to be essential in heaven. Those are your personal beliefs, but you're open to the resolution in heaven to being a lot more complex than any of us thinks.
Yeah.
Is that fair? Is that fair to say?
Like I said earlier, there's some aspects of my faith that I'm more agnostic about maybe than others, right? And so I'll openly admit to those. And then there's others that I am like pretty more convinced of. But at the end of the day, like, as far as the afterlife goes, like we're just not there yet. Like none of us know completely, right? So I'm hesitant to say like, I know this is the way things are going to be. And I'm absolutely certain. And, like no way there's no possible way that it could be anything different. I always say that I am counting on being surprised in the afterlife, because if I get there and I'm not surprised, it's going to be very surprising.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. And what I hear you modeling is what I've heard referred to as epistemic humility, that you may have beliefs, but you're admitting shades of belief, anything from, knowledge and confidence to just total agnosticism and uncertainty, and an ultimate openness to being completely wrong. Right.
Yeah. So I want to go to Heath's question as far as like, is my belief or kind of hope in the Mormon God, the actual Mormon God, right? And I would just go back to my earlier statement in that I don't think Mormonism has ever been a monolithic experience. I think even within the general authorities, like you have individuals who conceive of God in different ways. I mean, surely with Orson Pratt and Brigham Young, they certainly didn't agree as to the nature of God, right? So there hasn't been a monolithic Mormon God in the first place. Our conception of deity, even outside Mormonism too. Like you look at the Bible and the New Testament and even the Book of Mormon, views on God develop. Our understanding of the divine changes, and it hasn't been the same from day one to now. So I would like to think that I do believe in God. I believe in a divine being. I believe in Heavenly Mother, right? A divine feminine, divine masculine. I believe in these things. I believe that I have a relationship with God. I believe that other people who aren't Mormon have a relationship with God. So I don't necessarily see our specific individual, mortal, limited conceptions of deity as being too limiting as to how deep of a relationship we can have with God. So just the fact that Mother Teresa might have conceived of God in a Trinity, she certainly, actually, maybe she's not the best example because she struggled a lot with her personal faith. But, just individuals, Gandhi, individuals like that, outside of my own faith tradition, when you are serving humanity and the way you live your life is just so phenomenal and praiseworthy, I'd like to think that they have a pretty thorough understanding of who God is, and what the purpose of life is too, when I'm seeing them live a certain way. That's kind of what it boils down to for me. So I would push back on this kind of correlated idea that God is one way, which, whoever God is, whoever he ends up to be at the end of the day, like that's absolute. And, so you can't have like Jesus being God, but also not God at the same time. There's some exclusive truth claims that we have to recognize, but in looking at like the development of theology in the Bible from an early kind of polytheistic, patristic, or like early patriarch view to kind of monolatry, where, the Israelites, they worship and cling to one God, but recognize other divine beings exist. They just don't worship them because they're not in a covenant relationship, to more of an ethical monotheism that was instituted through the Josiah reforms to an early Trinitarianism by the early Christian church.
And the Book of Mormon.
Right? Yeah, no, exactly, right?
Yeah.
So we just have to understand that, like, yes, there's more messiness, there's complexity. And when you break these things down, like I'm just doing the best with what I have, with what I feel has been like revealed or confirmed to me. I recognize other people are in different locations, and very much like our individual cultures also reflect or can influence how we conceive of God. So, like when you look at depictions of Heavenly Father or Jesus in artwork, Caucasian, white, old guys, maybe, British accents, in movies, maybe, right? Like you look in India with Hinduism, you have different deities who reflect local animals, right? People are very much inclined to project deity as reflective of who they are, right? So I think that's very natural. And that's something that like,
it's odd because in the modern Mormon church, it's old white men, which is kind of who leads the church.
Right. So I'd like to conceive of okay, I'm open to the idea that Joseph Smith could have seen God the Father and Jesus Christ appear in that form. Like, I'm not opposed to deity taking on different forms to appear to us in ways that we're comfortable with or familiar with. But that doesn't necessarily make God's race white and Caucasian. You know what I'm saying? Like,
what about anthropomorphic? Does God need to be anthropomorphic, an exalted human?
I think that's unique to Mormonism, and very much the concept of like Mormon theosis or exaltation is something I feel I see as very compelling and appealing. And so, yes, like I do hold to an anthropomorphic belief in God, or just that I do see us as gods in embryo, or that we can progress to a state that God now is, right? So I do hold to that view. I don't know what a divine body looks like. I've never seen one. So I can't speak to what that is. But I do believe that we are of the same being as God, right? And that we can progress to kind of his status. So
one of the questions I keep getting from people as they're listening, a lot of our listeners, including Miles, people are saying, okay, on the one hand, Jackson, you want to say that, none of us can have a complete understanding of God, that our understanding of God continues to evolve. And those who know Mormon history will know that the version of God in the Book of Mormon is actually different than the version of God that Joseph Smith was teaching in Nauvoo. And so even within the church's lifetime, the church has evolved. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Adam God theory with Brigham Young and Orson Pratt and others, it's messy. However, others are going to say that, no, that's why we have prophets. Prophets are here to tell us what the nature of God is. Joseph and the Restoration were here to clear it all up. And so you can't have it both ways. One, that there's a restoration, the prophets clear all this up and tell us what's true. And yet, Jackson, what some are saying is you want to hold on to this sort of flexible view where it could be anything and we have limited understanding. A lot of people want to say that's the whole reason why we had a restoration, and that's why we have prophets.
It is to better understand the nature of God.
Yeah. As a core thing, right? As a core tenet of Mormonism is that Joseph helped want to clarify who God was and why we should believe in him.
And I don't disagree with that. Like I do look to like the King Follett discourse and a lot of Joseph's later understanding of deity as both unique and very necessary to at least my Mormon identity. It sets it apart in the realm of world religions. And so, I do feel like Joseph, I believe that Joseph restored or expanded or clarified aspects of God, such as, teaching that we are of the same being as God. There's no ontological divide between God and man as traditional Christianity is held. I mean, it's a radical move that Judaism, Islam, and Christianity in all their traditional forms never get to. Yes, like the early church fathers in the early Christian church did teach that we can experience godhood through God's grace, but they never taught that we are of the same ontological kind as God, right? This is something that, at least for me, is unique to Joseph. And so because I believe in it, like I do believe he restored that. I think this brings us kind of into a conversation on my views on revelation and prophets that I can kind of go into now. So contrary maybe to the correlation view of prophets, in that individuals who maybe can never teach something false, or have kind of like a one-way connection with God, like a game of telephone kind of, where God speaks through them and it's verbatim and everything. I somewhat look at prophets a little bit differently. Like I believe that they're inspired. I believe that they can have bona fide revelations. But I look at the process of revelation, and I see something very complex going on with Joseph in particular that sets the model for how I see revelation to begin with. So I see revelation as kind of a three-part process, in that we have deity who wants to speak to man, has to condescend to a level of human understanding, express kind of what he wants to say, or the inspired words that he's telling these individuals, which we label as prophets. So he speaks to them in language they can understand. The individual in question, the prophet, has to then recognize that revelation taking place. They have to make sense of it. They have to grapple with it, and then they have to repackage it for delivery to a larger audience. And so I guess what I'm saying is I'm more open to the influence and role of the human involvement in that process, rather than making it all just on God to speak, his clear word. It's like a two-way type process. It's both God being involved, but man also being involved. And so I recognize that I don't hold revelations to be infallible or inerrant. In fact, a lot of times they are colored by the individual experience and perspective and understanding of that current individual in question. And so that's going to reflect on the way that they kind of give these these So I do believe that prophets are inspired. I believe that we're led by inspired men today, through the LDS Church. I believe individuals can be inspired outside the LDS Church, but that what sets the LDS prophets apart for me, or at least the leadership, is I do believe like in priesthood authority, and I believe in saving ordinances and things like that. So I do think that the leaders of the church have been given stewardship over these saving ordinances, and that that's why they alone can access them. But that doesn't rule out my belief that Pope Francis is being inspired right now to lead the Catholic Church, or other individuals who are seeking after God can find inspiration as well. So when I read texts like the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and even scriptures outside the faith, I just see this process of God and man coming together, and it being a joint effort, and the scriptures are very much colored by the human experience as much as they are by the divine experience as well. And so I guess maybe it's more gray than some black and white conceptions have been in the past.
Can prophets just get it wrong?
I think so. Mind? I mean, hey, we already discussed Adam God theory. I don't agree with that, so that's something that obviously Brigham Young held to dearly at I think the latter end of his life. And so, yeah, I do believe that they can get it wrong. And that's why, for me personally, I cling to the individual responsibility to seek after confirmation, and again, strive after what I feel is authentic and right, and live that. So when
are you comfortable sharing the areas where you feel like the prophets have got it wrong, or are you not comfortable doing that?
Blacks in the priesthood, I don't think that was legit as far as being inspired. I think the fact that Joseph ordained black men in his lifetime, and also when I read the Book of Mormon, I see a text that, contrary to a lot of people's opinions or interpretations, I see it as condemning racism rather than supporting it. I think when individuals have used the Book of Mormon in the past to support their individual perspectives on race, I think that's been mistaken. I don't think that's the Book of Mormon's ultimate message. And so I would have loved to see Mormonism move forward as a very progressive faith that continues to ordain black men, during that time period. And I think that the priesthood ban, it was a stain on the church. I don't think it was inspired. I think a lot of it was perpetuated by acceptance of the status quo at the time. And I think Brigham Young and other individuals very much, it just shows how prophets can and do at times bring their own backgrounds and experiences and perspectives as part of their ministry. So I don't think it was inspired. As far as the church goes, they have no official statement whether or not it was inspired. If you've read the Gospel Topic essay, it's just kind of we don't really know for sure. I recognize that. I don't feel like it was inspired. And so I don't see it that way. I feel like that was a major place that we could have done better, and that it's unfortunate that that things were perpetuated for that long.
If you could just list any other areas, some would say there's some pretty explicit racism in the Book of Mormon, basically claiming that God curses people with dark skin because of their wickedness and to make them appear loathsome to the non-dark people. Mm-hmm. Do you consider that to be a mistake?
Yeah. I think, again, this is just exemplifying the human experience in scripture such as the Book of Mormon. So when I look at statements by, it was either Nephi or Jacob that first talk about that, you have a separation between the two family groups, and a change of skin color is noted between them. So we'll talk about my views on the Book of Mormon later, because this ties into them. I hold to a limited geography theory and kind of an expansionist view of the translation. But as far as matters of race in the Book of Mormon go, I feel like its ultimate message is to kind of condemn racism, because it was divisions by class and race, or by ethnicity, by group, that ultimately led to the downfall of one of the major civilizations in the Book of Mormon. And I see places in Second Nephi, black and white all are alike to God. So
you see the Book of Mormon as actually having errors then, as it relates to the idea of God cursing people with dark skin for their wickedness.
I view it just like I do the Bible. So when I read about the conquest of the Canaanites in Joshua, and the justification that comes for genocide and things like that, I can't conceive of a deity that would condone that. And so it's in matters like this that seem to run contrary to what I believe God would do, that I'm usually I think that's human interaction in the text. And I can usually find places that I feel very much speaks to the role of human influence. So I see the Bible and the Book of Mormon similarly, in that, I think they're influenced by their authors. I think that they're subject to the dispositions and the biases of the individuals who wrote them, and they're reflective of their different experiences. So sometimes that includes individuals grappling with intense problems, such as immediately following let's say the conquest of the Canaanites. Well, now we have to justify it. It might just be easier to say that God condoned it, and that's why we did it. So
what about the church's policies with LGBT people? And you don't have to give deep explanations of these things. I'm just curious where you see the church as making mistakes. Do you see the church's policies with LGBT people being mistakes?
Well, I think I definitely recognize that there's been a development of the church's stance on LGBT matters over the different decades. I think we're moving forward in a better place, but we're still seeing kind of maybe internal remnants or struggles of how we're actually going to approach same-sex attraction or different sexual orientations as a church. I think there's more kind of progressive voices in church leadership that see things one way, and others who are more conservative or traditional that see things another way. I can say that, and this is a view that's changed of mine in about in the past year or so, is kind of my reaction to the November 15th or November 5th policy from 2015. Originally, when that came out, I was like, hey, sounds good. Like, I don't really mind. Right. I was like, this is something that I can sustain my church leaders on. My views have changed since then. I can say in maybe a diplomatic way that it's not something that I have a testimony of.
Okay.
It's
what about the church's opposition to legal same-sex marriage?
Yeah, I mean, Prop 8 was a major thing that affected my mom, and that she had some major problems with. I think we've developed and made progress now, and there's been statements made where members of the church can support civil same-sex unions and not run in danger of like church discipline or things.
You mean
like
same-sex marriage?
Yeah.
So are you in support of civil same-sex marriage personally?
I am.
Okay.
I'm rather libertarian when it comes to marriage.
Okay.
When it comes to consent and things like that, I would be just as supportive of individuals in a same-sex marriage as I would in a heterosexual marriage, as I would in even a polygamous marriage if individuals consented to that.
Well, what about the church not always, sometimes hiding or misleading or not being forthright about its history? Do you feel like the church has made mistakes there?
Yes, I feel like they have. And I feel like there's places in history that we can point to where we had the potential to go forward, such as I think it was with Leonard Arrington. Didn't he have a multi-volume series of church history? Yeah, and that got
scrapped.
That was in the 70s, I think, too.
Yeah, along with his whole administration eventually got scrapped. Right?
Yeah, right? So I see, and that was like, turning into the correlation era or at the height of it or whatever. I generally don't look at the correlation era as something positive that happened to the church. I think, there's obvious complexity that comes with creating a global ecclesiastical organization and trying to have orthodoxy throughout it, that's a complex matter. I feel like in terms of correlation, though, we swung too far in terms of fundamentalism, and it's affecting people negatively, and we're paying for it now. And I think we're going to continue to pay for it for several decades. I mentioned how in my lifetime I've witnessed the church kind of, at least in its curriculum, move away from a very traditional correlation-based narrative to one that's more open to transparency and talking about issues. I think we're going to continue to do that. The Joseph Smith Papers Project is phenomenal. There's very positive steps that I recognize with the church where I'm like, that should have happened in the 70s. If that would have happened in the 70s, there's generations of individuals in the correlation era that I think wouldn't have left the church or wouldn't have had as major problems with it. So like when I talk to people, and this is something that, I'm certain that you've heard as well, individuals aren't so opposed to the idea of seer stones being used in the translation as they are to just feeling like they weren't informed in the first place, right? It's more the hurt of feeling like I didn't have the full picture to begin with when there was information out there. Then, wow, like I can accept Moses healing people with a bronze serpent, but I can't accept seer stones. Like most people, when they look at these miracles or what would be considered miraculous, it's not a huge leap to accept seer stones as part of the translation process. The bigger issue is when individuals feel like they didn't have access or they weren't informed in these matters in the first place. And I feel like that is a problem that was both cultural in nature, but certainly institutional correlation efforts didn't help it. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I could probably rant about correlation for a while just because I've seen a lot of hurt that it's caused in my family and family members. And, you know, I'm sure you have as well.
What about the church excommunicating, you know, people who doubt or question or talk openly about these things?
Like maybe the September 6th?
Them, Jeremy Runnels, Kate Kelly, me, you know, lots of people, right?
Well, I mean, it is a personal process. So it's not like I was in your disciplinary court, or I haven't lived your experience. I haven't lived Jeremy's experience. I haven't lived Kate's or the September 6th. Some of the September 6th, it was interesting. Like in the case of, I think his last name is Gigliotti, Abraham Gigliotti. I don't know how to pronounce his last name.
Gigliotti, I think. Yeah,
Gigliotti. He was actually seen as a little bit too, not so progressive as he was on the other end of the spectrum. So that was just kind of an interesting episode. I don't think, like, I'm not a fan of excommunicating people for asking questions like that. If I'm right, if I'm getting this right, like the Calderwoods, right? When I hear their story, like that kind of surprises me that even happened to them. Because, you know, they were just kind of asking questions. I think when it comes to like openly saying like, I don't believe in Mormonism, and, you know, I am advocating for critiques of the faith or things like that. You know, like I'm not opposed to excommunication for matters like that. I would like to believe that like individuals who don't even believe anymore leave before they get excommunicated, or at least they're given the chance to be like, okay, I'm going to resign my membership because why am I even here in the first place? You know, I can't speak for you. I can't speak for Jeremy. You know, I'm not too familiar with the particulars of either of your experiences. But there's instances where I think excommunication might be warranted, and then others where I've heard it go, you know, in a very awful direction that maybe wasn't too fair. So I don't know. I have mixed feelings on it. It's kind of, because it's an individual matter, it's going to be a case-by-case basis.
Okay. So one of the big questions people are asking you online is, that's fine, Jackson. You are willing to say the brethren are imperfect. You're willing to say that there should be a big tent. You're willing to look at Mormonism in a universalistic way, that there are many paths in the superhighway to exaltation. But a lot of people are saying, yeah, but that's not the Mormonism we live in. That's not how the church leaders see the church. And all this sort of buffet, liberal, progressive, open-minded Mormonism that you feel good about is not modern Mormonism. Mm-hmm. If you talk to, you know, any of the Quorum of the 12 or the First Presidency, they would object to most, if not all, of what you're saying. They might even punish you for it. And so what you're believing in is a brand of Jacksonian Mormonism, you know, but it's not Mormonism, and it's not 21st century Mormonism. And it's not something that would be endorsed by the people that you sustain as prophets, seers, and revelators.
Mm-hmm. I think that's interesting. So my reaction to kind of accusations that I'm practicing what's been called Jacksonism, or, you know, that I'm like a salad bar Mormon, is when I bring up these views on Mormonism that I have, I'm just as ready to back them up with quotes from general authorities and from, you know, citations from scripture and things like that to kind of give them more weight than just me being like, you know, this is just my feelings. Like I don't feel personally like I'm out on a limb here. Like I feel like I can justify all these different viewpoints that I hold, you know, in some way or another.
By statements from modern prophets, seers, and revelators?
It depends. Some of them. I mean, you have a good section on your website where you have quotes from LDS church leaders that support or inspire you, and some of those are by modern church member or church leaders that I feel like if I had a conversation with them and kind of expressed where I'm at, maybe there's some things we would disagree with, but overall, I feel like it wouldn't be like a hostile, like I wouldn't be the apostate in the situation, because here I am affirming the institution. I am, inviting others to learn more about the faith. I am, faithful and believing in terms of I can go through the temple recommend questions and answer them all honestly, and give the answers, where I'm a temple worthy member, So in terms of like how unorthodox I am, I don't see myself as counter orthodox. There's some views I have that are a little unorthodox and maybe do run counter to the narrative that has been taught. But again, I don't recognize Mormonism as a monolithic experience in the first place.
No, I know you've made that point, but let me just, and I'm not trying to argue. I just want to be really clear. You won't hear modern prophets, seers, and revelators at General Conference saying things like, God is bigger than what we understand, and the church is one of many highways to salvation. And we make, maybe you'll hear them say just recently that they make mistakes. But what you more often hear is follow us. We are the path. We know what's right, etc. You won't hear them talking about a lot of the nuanced things. You hear them basically still pounding the correlated sort of orthodox message. So I know your broad view of Mormonism is expansive. I want you to address the idea that the Q15 are not advocating publicly the brand of Mormonism that you seem to be holding to. And how do you make sense of that discrepancy?
Well, again, I think it plays into experience. Like I can't help but have a lot of these views on my faith because of my lived experience. My exposure to other religions has very much brought me to kind of this perspective. And so it's not that I'm purposefully going out of my way to kind of be unorthodox. Like this is just how, this is how I see the world. And so I look at them the same way. Like a lot of them, I would assume, can't help but see things in a certain way. They're free to do that and free to kind of establish boundaries for orthodoxy within the faith. I don't have a problem with that. I almost expect them to, because it might be kind of weird, if the opposite were true, if leaders of a particular religion were saying, hey, go, the other guys are just as good, or just as valid. We're on the same level as Pope Francis or things like that. Like, I'm not saying that they're on the same level, because in my belief, like I do look to them as prophets, seers, and revelators in God's church. So like in my life, they take precedence. I look to them as the authorities in my life. I can look to others as well outside the faith. But primarily, because my identity is that of a Latter-day Saint, I affirm them in their positions, in their authority, and I look to them while at the same time feeling free and without conflict in kind of having some of these other views. I've had very frank conversations with different church leaders, whether they're bishops or stake presidents or things like that, where I kind of share my thoughts on these matters. Recently, I've become a lot more comfortable doing that within kind of a one-on-one basis with local church leaders. I've never really gotten pushback, I just explain where I'm at, where I'm coming from, and, throw some quotes in there, kind of justify myself through scripture. And it's not something I feel like I can be disciplined for, or that I can receive a lot of pushback. People can disagree for sure, and they can support their views on Mormonism, their takes on Mormonism differently, and back them up with different quotes. I mean, obviously someone could go through and still push for correlated Mormonism because there's a plethora of quotations that they could support with those. I think it's a process for each person. And so I kind of resist the accusation that I'm cherry picking Mormonism, or that I'm like a cafeteria Mormon, because at the end of the day, my question is, who is not a cafeteria Mormon? Like, who do we look to as like the pinnacle of what a Mormon is? Because if we look to the Q15 now, there's going to be differences in them, in each one of them, likely, whether minor or, maybe major, between them and prophets and leaders of past years of the church. Or, like my whole thing is there's never been consistency. And so we shouldn't expect there to be just consistency all around, because if someone is to say like, I'm not a full Mormon, what is a full Mormon? How are we defining that? Is that presently defined by the Quorum of the 12? Is that defined by McConkie's version of Mormonism? Is it Joseph Smith's view on Mormonism? So that's my question, is like, who would we look to in the first place to even establish that? Because the whole nature of progressive revelation and changing church leadership and things like that has shown that it's more complex than just this is what a Mormon looks like. And, if you don't kind of fit this cookie cutter mold, then you're not fully a Mormon. People draw boundary lines for sure, and leaders do that for sure. But those boundary lines, even in history, haven't always been consistent as far as what is and isn't orthodoxy,
Yet certainly you would love to see the leaders give more inclusive messages, probably admit to their mistakes, apologize when they make mistakes, encourage a support and appreciation for diversity, or not. I don't mean to put words in your mouth.
No, I feel like that's happening. Like we're seeing that happen more and more. If I can, let me go to a quote by Uchtdorf.
As you're looking up the quote, a lot of people are wanting to know if you've been through the temple yet as an endowment.
I'm planning on doing that in the spring though. So that's coming up pretty soon. And what I can say about that is that I'm definitely not going in blind. I kind of, beyond temple prep, I know what to expect. So I'm not going in about to be surprised by any means. Okay, so here's something I loved hearing from Holland recently. It was at just a recent conference. The talk is songs sung and unsung. He said he's comparing the church or the gospel to a choir, right? And I think this is so inclusive. He says, brothers and sisters, we live in a mortal world with many songs we cannot or do not yet sing. But I plead with each one of us to stay permanently and faithfully in the choir, where we will be able to savor forever the most precious anthem of all, a song of redeeming love. Fortunately, the seats for this particular number are limitless. There is room for those who speak different languages, celebrate diverse cultures, and live in a host of locations. There's room for the single and for the married, for large families and for the childless. There's room for those who once had questions regarding their faith, and room for those who still do. There is room for those with differing sexual attractions. In short, there is a place for everyone who loves God and honors his commandments as the inviolable measuring rod of personal behavior. For if love of God is a melody of our shared song, surely our common quest to obey him is the indispensable harmony in it. With divine imperatives of love and faith, repentance and compassion, honesty and forgiveness, there is room in this choir for all who wish to be there. Come as you are, a loving Father says to each one of us. But he adds, don't plan to stay as you are. We smile and remember that God is determined to make more of us than we thought we could be. So, I understand that, we can have a conversation about whether or not that reflects institutionally things that have happened in the church or things that still are happening. But it's statements like this that give me hope. It's things like this that I can pull from modern general authorities or from previous ones, where I see a very inclusive message. And so it's because I find them so appealing, and I find so much hope in them that I accent them a little bit. Like they stand out in my personal faith as kind of like the main things that I draw inspiration from, And so when I look to different individuals who have different takes on Mormonism, people accent different statements and give them more emphasis, So if you want to push for correlated Mormonism, you can definitely find quotes that do that. I'm pushing for more of an inclusive Mormonism. And so this is an example of quotes of various quotes that I would pull to kind of justify where I'm at and what I'm pushing for.
And I think that's reasonable and beautiful and optimistic. I'm sure you can see that some of those quotes, when given, even though they rightly give you hope, and I think they really do indicate the direction of the church, at best, sometimes they can they can be seen as superficial in the sense that they're just kind of PR statements that are made selectively, that don't necessarily have a lot of weight behind it. But at the other extreme, they can actually be seen as very invalidating and almost deceptive or insulting. Because if a child who's the child of a same-sex married couple, or even a same-sex married couple, wants to actually participate in full communion with the saints, they certainly can't.
I agree.
And so they're going to feel insulted or misled by statements that suggest the church is more open and diverse than it really is. Do you acknowledge that?
No, I do acknowledge that. There's definitely a tension, and definitely actions in the church don't always represent some of these ideals that I would say we're striving for, so.
Right. Okay, good. That's fair. That's totally fair.
Yeah. Like I think we fall short. We still struggle.
Okay.
But at least it's quotes like this that give me permission or validation in what I'm trying to push for. You know what I'm saying? So.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. And I think hopefully everybody wants the church to be a healthier, happier place. Yeah. And any ex-Mormon or post-Mormon that doesn't want the church to get better and to do better and to harm less people, I struggle with that person. Right?
I do too.
Okay. So we talked about your belief in God. How important is it in your faith, this idea of a literally resurrected, historical, Jesus as the Son of God sort of thing?
I don't know if you could have a form of Mormonism that's still authentic to something that could be considered Mormonism that doesn't have Christ as a centerpiece or a major component,
And what about a resurrected Christ? Is that essential?
Yeah, I mean, same thing. Like I think like once, so there's certain points of orthodoxy that I would say like we kind of have to maintain in order to maintain something of a Mormon identity. Once you start giving away, taking away from them, I don't really know what's left to set Mormonism apart or give it vitality, Okay. So like, same thing if like, let's say we were to say the Book of Mormon isn't scripture. I don't know if you could retain a Mormon identity that's legitimate, like I don't know how someone could make that work. I certainly can't.
Well, let me just tell you, there are people that don't necessarily believe in supernatural sort of things. Mm-hmm. They believe that maybe Jesus was a historical figure. Yeah. And maybe they love the teachings that are attributed to Jesus, but they don't know that they can sign up for a virgin birth and this need for him to be punished for humans that are made imperfect to then, to make it right for their sins, that God would even need to punish someone for other people's mistakes. And then that this being was perfect on the earth. And then this person transcended death. And so what they do is they say, well, I could believe in the teachings of Jesus and, the teachings of faith and humility and kindness and charity and love. But I just have no idea if actually a Jesus resurrected. Okay, do you want these people? Do you think these people shouldn't consider themselves Mormon? Shouldn't consider themselves worthy?
What you're describing to me sounds more like someone who is more agnostic or is approaching these things with what we mentioned, epistemic humility, right? Where I don't like who can prove that there was a virgin birth. I don't know any of us could prove it in a sense. A lot of us hold to that belief for sure, and very strongly so. But as far as knowing and recognizing the extent of our knowledge, I want to make church a place where individuals at different points in their faith journey are comfortable with. I would love for church to be a place where we recognize that not everyone is at the same place. Like, there's still points of orthodoxy that I think, are integral to identity. But if there, let's say, is an individual in the room who isn't sure, or maybe even doesn't believe in a literal historical Book of Mormon, right? I don't think they should be excluded from membership because of that. I look to kind of the Temple Recommend interview questions as a model for our test of orthodoxy. I mean, we have like 3 or 4 that have to have anything to do with personal affirmations of belief. Do you believe like in a restoration? Do you believe in God or Jesus or the atonement? or, things like that. But how one goes about believing in those things are left rather open-ended, where just giving a yes is fine. Even though there's this orthodoxy that attaches a lot more beliefs to that, when it comes to the temple and when it comes to the very question that's asked, do you believe in Jesus Christ and his atonement? If someone can answer yes to that and feel authentic with themselves, that yes is good enough to get them a temple recommend pass.
What if someone, when they say yes, they don't really have any belief that Jesus actually resurrected, and they don't really believe that Jesus had to be punished for everyone's sins in aggregate, and instead what they believe is, I have no idea if Jesus ever lived, I'm kind of a little bit skeptical, but I love his teachings about kindness and service.
Yeah.
Are you okay with that person deciding that they're worthy to have a temple recommend?
Yeah. I'm not sure, actually. That's something I'll have to think about personally, because I'll have to give more thought to that, because that's a personal matter that I don't know if I could make judgment on that. That seems more like a conversation to be had between an individual and their bishop, and between an individual and God, right? I'm not against the idea of drawing boundary lines for temple worship and temple observance, or kind of setting aside space that maybe we do hold as orthodoxy that individuals need to believe certain things in a certain way. Otherwise I don't see much point in even going to the temple in the first place to engage in these ceremonies and rituals. Let's say if an individual doesn't believe in them in the first place. Like, I certainly don't believe that someone should be baptized if they don't believe in baptism in the first place, or if it doesn't have meaning to them.
No, but someone can just say, hey, the temple's a great place to contemplate and to meditate and to feel spirituality. Yeah. And baptism is a way to just show your commitment to, living good principles.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be saying, I know that Jesus resurrected and was punished for all our sins. You know what I mean? It can mean a lot of things. Christianity can be non-literal. The Christian world, as you know, is full of people that are like, yeah, absolutely. Jesus, Moses may not have existed. I mean, really, think about what you've studied about the Old Testament. There are tons of Jews that don't even believe that Moses existed.
Of course.
And if Moses and Abraham didn't exist, then the whole covenant that Jesus swore to didn't really happen. And so sort of the whole thing gets undermined.
Or there's lots of Jews that don't even believe in God too, but still retain the identity of Judaism. So I'm not opposed to the idea of Mormonism becoming more like Judaism in this sense.
That's how you started this interview, right?
Yeah. But what's nice about Judaism is that there's different flavors of Judaism and different synagogues for different types of people. You have the range from more orthodox to more liberal forms of Judaism. So an individual within Judaism who wants to have that kind of experience, they're able to go to a different synagogue or, just kind of move over. Same with Christianity. There's a lot of diversity that, there's liberal Christianity and more orthodox fundamentalist Christianity. Within Mormonism, just in terms of numbers, I don't know if we're there, just because the mass amount of individuals who identify as Mormon belong to the Latter-day Saint Church. I think the Community of Christ is a great example for, or a place maybe for individuals who want to retain identity with the Restorationist movement, and still want to hold on to a lot of these things, but also want to feel more institutionally comfortable within this kind of setting as per the views that they're currently having.
Okay, I just want to say that and this isn't a condemn or challenge you, I'm hearing a bit of a mixed message from you, because on the one hand, you do say you want Mormonism to be more like Judaism, where there could be the equivalent to Reformed Judaism, where you don't have to believe in God or Moses, or the literality of Judaism is sort of the one true path. And you're saying that you're not so sure, how could anyone sort of claim to be Mormon if they don't have a literal belief in Christ's resurrection?
One thing I'm doing, I'm using terms that kind of bleed over into different categories. So when I talk about Mormonism, we can talk about Mormonism in an LDS context, or we can talk about Mormonism as a broader umbrella of Mormonism.
Right now, I'm interested in your views about the LDS Church.
Okay, the LDS Church. Yeah. I'm fine with the LDS Church kind of maintaining statements of orthodoxy or certain standards of orthodoxy because it's an institution. I think it has that ability as an institution. I would like to see more comfort for individuals who still want to participate in the community, but aren't necessarily at the same place belief-wise. So, if an individual in priesthood or Relief Society or something like that associates with Latter-day Saint Mormonism through their culture, but other than that, they don't necessarily ascribe to a lot of the same beliefs. I want those individuals to feel comfortable, or at least have a space to participate. I don't know if I would agree with full participation being granted, just because I think, an institution has the right to kind of establish those lines of orthodoxy. But currently where we're at, I would like to see improved to where individuals with doubts, with questions, who feel more like the black sheep, they feel more comfortable fitting in. And there's instances where certain wards have taken measures to make individuals like that feel comfortable. But I would like to see that become more of the norm as opposed to the exception. But as far as temple access or baptism or things like that, it's more a decision for maybe church leadership for how they would want to go about it. I would just hope that an individual in the pews can show up to church and they feel like the community is welcoming to them.
The challenge, not to turn this back on me, but I was struggling to remain active and faithful up until my excommunication. Yeah. And I can tell you that I expressed just doubts about the existence of God and doubts about this teaching around a literal resurrection. Just sort of, I don't know. I'm not sure I believe it. Sometimes it seems too convenient. I was going through a legitimate period where I was just doubting and questioning. And the message I got is you can believe and doubt whatever you want, just don't speak about it publicly. And your podcast is too big of a platform. That's kind of where it got problematic. Yeah. But it was just this sense that you can have doubts and struggles, just keep it to yourself or keep it quietly to your leaders. It's just as soon as you try and talk openly and publicly about it, where you reach a problem. And I didn't love that. I didn't love this idea that, you had to hide and keep secret who you are or were out of fear. And then the second thing I didn't love is a sense of being a second-class citizen. If I'm open about my doubts, if I'm going through a genuine faith crisis and I want to baptize my child, or I want to go through the temple to see my sibling or my niece or nephew get baptized, then I'm going to be publicly shamed by being told I can't baptize my kid, or I can't go through the temple, or that I have to be a second-class citizen in the church. That was really hard for me.
Yeah. There's certainly tensions there. I totally get that. But it just seems like kind of a tough situation. Because I can definitely see your perspective, and I can see the institutional perspective too, where
an
institution that has a certain mission or a certain focus or a certain message, right, wants that focus to remain on that message, So at least I would hope that church is a place where we are taught the gospel, right? But at the same time, individuals can question it and things like that. But I don't know. I mean, I would want questions to be expressed in class. I've certainly expressed questions in class. I've expressed doubts in class. And I would want people to be comfortable with doing that. I kind of mentioned how in some of my experiences with seminary, a lot of times we would just stop the lesson altogether, right? And just start answering questions and having a conversation. I think sometimes that's very effective. Sometimes maybe not so much, because it takes the focus off of maybe something, that was the real focus for the day. I don't know.
It's messy. It's messy.
Yeah, it's
and
messy.
I appreciate your answers.
There's a time and a place for things. And so it's hard for me to kind of give
totally.
generalities.
And I agree that an organization needs to be able to have limits and set boundaries, or it's not really an organization or a community. A community or an organization without boundaries is not a community. Right. It's not an organization. Exactly. So I understand that it's just difficult.